Welcome back to Biblical and Theological Reviews. I am Dr. Burt Jordan, and I am reviewing commentaries. I am reviewing spiritual books, theological books that I have used throughout my ministry and believe it would be very helpful in the long run to many of you out there today, especially a young preacher or teacher that's out there today that may not be familiar with some of these, unfortunately, what we call maybe antique in a way, or they're older and we don't want to consult those works and things such as that. And one of the reasons we say that is because they are very thorough and very difficult sometimes to read, but not to comprehend. So today I'm going to be looking at a commentary that I first used, again, with some help from the old F.E. Sutton bookstore many years ago in Jacksonville, Florida, and that is the Matthew Henry's commentary. This is just one volume of it. As you can see, they actually have 6 volumes of it. And volume 1 is Genesis to Deuteronomy, and we'll be taking some of our comments and things from this first one today, because the rest of the books also cover the same kind of background and same kind of format and layout that is in this first volume. Matthew Henry is a devotional commentary. That is not to say that he cannot be more thorough at times. He does throw some Greek and Latin in there. But for the most part, he is a very practical, a very devotional. In fact, these are things that he studied with his family. These are notes and things he took with them. Now, there are times when he did preach it because he was a preacher in the nonconformist movement at that time. And so today, as we look at it, you can see this is the green Revell copy that's still out there. There are cheaper copies. There are even more modernized copies in many ways, but this can still be found out there, and normally within, under $100, all 6 volumes, and usually in extremely good shape or pretty good shape. But what the commentary is about is pretty clear, as you see as you see it first. You see that Matthew Henry, you see a picture of him. That is who Matthew Henry is. And then you see some of the things it's saying about what it actually is going to be doing. And that is, and excuse me if I don't get this all lined up right, but notice that Matthew Henry's commentary on the whole Bible, wherein each chapter is summed up in its contents, the sacred text inserted at large in distinct paragraphs, each paragraph reduced to its proper heads, the sense given, and largely illustrated with practical remarks and observations. One of the things I like about that is that he breaks it down into paragraph and usable format and forms. He doesn't take large. In fact, you may say he was an expositional preacher, which, by the way, is not a bad thing to be. It's a very great way to preach. It's a very way to stay disciplined in where you need to be and what you need to be doing at that current period of time. So we see that he had practical marks and observations. And if you continue turning in the book, if you did, you would see a memoir of Matthew Henry, and the things that's by S. Palmer. And you learn a lot about Matthew Henry and the book you're getting ready to read and the author you're getting ready to read. Many of the older commentaries and good commentaries will let you know who you were reading after and where they were from and how they were educated and what they stood for, etc. So as you get past the memoirs at Matthew Henry, you come to the first book, an exposition with practical observations on the book of Genesis. And this is where we really catch and see Matthew Henry probably at his best. And I'm just going to read a couple of sections and a couple of parts here. And I'm going to start with Genesis 1:1, where, of course, it's in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Now we're going to get an idea of just how Matthew Henry and how useful he was as a very young preacher and teacher at that time, of which I was only 20 years old. And this was a well recommended resource, and I'm glad that I went to it. Now, notice in these verses, he breaks it down. He says, in its epitome, verse 1, we find to our comfort the first article of our creed, that God the Father Almighty is the maker of heaven and earth, and as such we believe in him. And then he starts making his observations. He says to observe in this verse 4 things. So he's seeing 4 things in verse 1, and that is the effect produced. That was the heaven and the earth. That is the world, including the whole frame and furniture of the universe, the world and all things therein. Second thing he talks about is the author and cause of this great work, God. The Hebrew word is Elohim, which bespeaks the power of God as creator. El signifies a strong God, and what less than mighty strength could bring out all things out of nothing. Then it also talks about the plurality of the Godhead, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Then he makes his third point, the manner in which this work was effected. God created it, that is, made it out of nothing. And then the fourth thing he has to say on verse 1 is when this work was produced, in the beginning, that is, the beginning of time, when that clock was first set with the production of those beings that are measured by time. Now you kind of get a little idea of how Matthew Henry actually broke down his expositions and broke down his commentaries and broke down what he had to say. Very usable chunks in form, and which is very useful for today's audience as well. And then he goes down to a second point, which goes to verse 2, and he said, here is the work of creation in its embryo, where we have an account of the first matter and the first mover. Now, if you've ever taken any philosophy courses and things, you remember that Plato and Aristotle and them felt like there was a first mover. They would not recognize it as God, but that's the way they looked at it. And notice he says 2 things about this verse here. He says, first of all, we have an account of the first matter and the first mover, and we have a chaos was the first matter. And then he moves on to say that the Spirit of God was the first mover. He moved upon the face of the waters. Now, we could go throughout this commentary and glean just those very same things that we've been doing with these first 2 verses in Genesis here. You can go over to Genesis 3, see about the same thing. Genesis 2. This is the way Matthew Henry lays out his work in Matthew Henry's commentary. I recommend it highly. I have used it many a day and still can use it today for my studies, and many times glean from him and use him as I teach. So Matthew Henry's commentary, 6 volumes, Revell Company, or you can get it in any other form or company if you would like, but it's still the same. It's Matthew Henry's commentary. I hope that you will find the same things in here that I have found.